Exodus 34, verses 1 to 10. The Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there, on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or be seen anywhere on the mountain. Not even flocks and herds may graze in front of the mountain." So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up Mount Sinai early in the morning, as the Lord had commanded him. And he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. "O Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes," he said, "then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance." Then the Lord said, "I am making a covenant with you before all your people. I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do."
1 John chapter 5 verses 1 to 5. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God.
So we begin to look at this passage in the 5th chapter of this letter from John, his first letter. And I want to point up to you first the statement that John makes, that if we belong to God, we show this by loving God and carrying out his commands. Love is an act of the will. It's very easy to say, "I love you." Maybe it's not, I don't know. I find it quite difficult sometimes to say that. But it can be something that we say, and it can be cheap words. When it comes to showing love, then that is something else again. For example, when it comes next Sunday, I think it is, to Mother's Day. Is that right? Mother's Day. It is one thing to say, I love you, Mum. It is another thing to say, Mum, I'll make you breakfast in bed. Mum, you don't cook dinner today. I'll cook dinner for you. So, I know that Fabricia would find that really exciting if James said, I'm cooking dinner today, because afterwards they wouldn't have a flat to live in. But actions, it is said, speak louder than words. And certainly in the case of love, that is so very true. And so in the two halves of this sentence, loving God and keeping his commands, they are really the same thing. And obviously the command that John has in mind more than any other, based, we can see, on what he has been saying in the previous 4 chapters, again, therefore, taking this passage in context, is that we should love our brothers and sisters. And that rings back to what Jesus said, that the greatest commands were to love the Lord our God with all our being, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And that is 3 acts of love. To love God, to love our neighbors, which again is another way of saying brothers and sisters, and again inclines us to think that within brothers and sisters there is a much broader dimension than just the fellow Christians, and to love ourselves. And we do well to remember in this that keeping his commands involves all of those commandments. And that's why in the earlier part of our service, in the passage that Jill read for us, we had that passage from Exodus, where Moses, a man who looked very like Charlton Heston in my experience. If you don't have an idea who Charlton Heston is, you're way too young. But he looked like Charlton Heston, and God said to him, chisel out some more tablets, because he had broken the original ones in a fit of anger at the way that the Israelites were behaving when he got to the foot of the mountain. And God is the God of the second chance. Moses had broken the tablets, and God gave the instructions again. He could have said, oh, you've blown it now, mate. It's all over. But he didn't. He was, as he says in that passage in Exodus, a covenant-making God and a covenant-keeping God. I read a story yesterday which was a fascinating story to me because, as you're aware, I love music and I spend a lot of time listening to music. And I was reading the story of a family who bought a new home in Minnesota in America. And when they moved into their house, it seemed that the previous owners had left some bits and pieces behind. And you might have thought, well, that's not a good way to behave. Why should we have to clear out their rubbish? And this family is a Jewish family, but not particularly a practicing Jewish family. And when their youngest son sat down in the living room of the new house, he noticed there was a gramophone that had been left behind. And he opened the gramophone to find that not only had the gramophone been left behind, but a record had been left on the gramophone. Now, for those who are young, a gramophone is like streaming music. And a record is a thing that you had to have in order to stream the music. And this record, we talk these days about vinyl, but vinyl tends to rotate at 33 revs per minute and occasionally at 45 revs per minute. This rotated at 78 revs per minute. And fortunately, the gramophone had been left with what I would refer to as a stylus. Some people in the old days used to call it a needle, to take an arm across to place on the grooves of the 78 revs per minute record. And so this young Jewish man, boy I should say, sat there and he listened to this record, and it was a country bluegrass record, kind of acoustic country music. And the lyrics of the song was, "You are drifting too far from the shore. Return to Jesus and live for him." And he said in this thing that I read that this was like a mystical moment for him. It almost seemed to him that he had found out that he had a new parent out there. That parent was God, and God had provided a message for him. And he learnt in that moment of a covenant that he knew nothing about at all. And it took him more than 30 years to come to the point where he thought, that message is for me. And it was way, way back in the annals of his mind. And then one day it crystallized that this was the way that you love God. And it says here in our passage in verse 1, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. And everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. And so we have the situation where if we say we love God, we must love Jesus. And if we say if we love God, then we must love the creatures that he has created. And that is why in our services at the moment we are praying for the people of Ukraine, because they are people who are being unjustly treated. And God has made them. Now in verse 4, after we have learnt that love for God involves obeying his commands, we learn that everyone born of God overcomes the world. Now, I was very familiar with phrases like this long before I understood what they meant, because they were the sort of things that came up in songs that people used to sing in songs when I first started going to church. And as you do when you go to church, you sing the songs, but you don't necessarily know what they mean. I remember there was one song that we used to sing when I first got involved in the church just a few years ago that said, "Victory is in our lives and in our hearts." And, you know, we sang it about 27 or 37 times because that was the way that you did in those days. And we clapped. And even sometimes people in the church danced as they were singing, because it was one of those kind of churches. And we celebrated the fact that we were victors. And then I went home afterwards and I thought, what the dickens did that mean? But if we look at what the Bible is saying, then we begin to understand. It says the victory that has overcome the world is our faith. And faith, we know, is faith here in God. It is not faith in anything else. It is faith in God and the fact that when this world fails, when this world comes to judgment, we will stand because we have trusted in the character of God. And so it is faith with a content. And so that song I mentioned earlier didn't last long in the songbooks of the church because it was just a bit of fluffy triumphalism. Didn't mean a lot. But this does mean a lot. It means that by our faith, our specific faith in what God has done, is doing, and will do, that when everything falls around us, we will stand. We will have a victory. And this is the hope for somebody who has been forced into serving his country in Ukraine at the moment. Because those young men who are losing their lives on the streets of Ukraine, they didn't want to be fighting that battle. And many, many of them will die. But those who die in the faith will not suffer in what John, in one of his later writings, calls the second death. They will triumph. Because in terms of our heritage, in terms of our background. The message of faith tells us that we do not belong here. Our family is not our family in the fullest sense. Like that young man listening to the 78 rev per minute record on an old gramophone. He said that he had a mystical experience where he understood that he had another father. He belonged to a different family. And it took him 30 years to figure out what that meant. But this sense of belonging is an amazing thing. It doesn't mean that you are disengaged from your earthly family in this world, but you become part of another family. The family of those who know that Jesus is the Son of God. And our passage that we read today closes with something that at the end of the encouragements is a little uncomfortable. Because John says, only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God is the one who has overcome the world. And we don't want hope in this world to be the exclusive territory of Christians. We don't want one religion to be better than the others, or at least we shouldn't. And this ties in very much with what I was talking about last week about our sense of destiny and the fact that God has a plan. And the big message here is that it doesn't matter today whether somebody thinks that they are a Christian. It doesn't matter today whether somebody is someone who goes to church or not. Because God has given us a stretch of time in this world. And like the young man with his gramophone, from the time he first heard the message that people were drifting too far from Jesus, it took him decades to figure out that he was one who needed to swim or paddle his boat back to the shore, to find the hope that it rests in the covenant. So that phrase here, where John says only the one, it doesn't have to be a cruel phrase. It does exclude some people, but there is time yet for people who describe themselves as Muslim or Hindu, people who describe themselves as Judaistic, people who describe themselves as Buddhist, people who describe themselves as atheist or secular, to find their way back to the shore of God's place. When they come and they encounter Jesus, who is the Son of God, then labels and titles, they don't count for too much. What truly matters is that they have become one of those who has found the hope and who has overcome the world. But it gives us a responsibility, because, you know, that 78 ref per minute record that I keep coming back to, it was recorded by some country singers that I mentioned earlier, and they had another song around the same time called "This World Cannot Stand Long." But it's still standing at the moment, and that gives us a period of time to share the message of Jesus Christ and his love, his death and resurrection, which we remember at Easter. This week we will be sharing that message with 250 adults and children. Pray that some of those children, there will be a kernel in the back of their mind that will take hold when they watch that play. And even if it takes 30 years, like it did in the illustration in our sermon, that one day that little acorn will grow into a big, big tree, which will bring strength and heart into the life of the person who sat and watched that play. And maybe they won't even remember when they first heard that story, but they will just be glad that because of it, on the final day, they will stand. Amen.